As we are going to start our practical labs, and this is going to be based on virtualization technologies that we're going to use. So we need to understand the concept of virtualization. And if you say what is virtualization, then virtualization allows you to operate more than one operating system on the same piece of hardware. So if you remember back in old days when there was no virtualization software, or the processors or the computers were not able to support the virtualization, what we had to do was, in order to run different services on different systems or on different operating systems, we had to use different hardwares. For example, if you wanted to use Exchange Server, if you wanted to use like SharePoint, if you wanted to use Active Directory domain controller for enterprise network, they had to just go and buy like hardwares for that. They had to purchase separate server for each services. And one thing that I really want to tell you is virtualization is really useful to save money, because most of the time why you really need to install two or more services on the same piece of hardware, that is to save money. But let me just give you an example. For example, I have server 1, I have server 2, and this server is for Exchange and this server is for SMTP service. That is something that you can enable inside your operating system. So if you go to your Windows Server 2012, 8, 2003, you can just install SMTP service that is built in operating system actually. So the thing is that most of the time, most services, when you install them on a same server or on a same piece of hardware, they conflicts with each other. What I mean to say is that if you are running Exchange Server on this piece of hardware, at the same time, if you want to use the built-in SMTP that is in operating system, once you install this SMTP service, what's going to happen? This Exchange Server will no longer work, because Exchange Server uses port 25 for SMTP. So SMTP is already used. It's a protocol, simple mail transfer protocol, that is used with Exchange Server. So what you're doing is, when you try to use two same protocols or same services on the same server, the difference is that this is a separate email application and this is built in an operating system. So what's going to happen is, like, this uses port 25 and this uses port 25. It's gonna end up with a conflict and it's no longer gonna work. So your Exchange will no longer work. So that there are many other applications out there that, when you install them on the same piece of hardware, they conflict with each other and most services stops running. So that's the main and important thing, and one of the biggest thing that you have to keep in your mind. That's why we really need to use virtualization, where what you are doing is you're actually using one server and then installing like 5, 10 operating systems on a same piece of hardware. So if this server that you see in here is like having more hardware specifications, like more RAM, more processor, what I can do is I can install 5 to 10 operating systems, or maybe more than that. So what I am doing in here is, like, I am virtualizing more than one operating system on a same piece of hardware. So what I am doing in here is I am saving money too. So if I have to install 10 servers, like in again, when there was no virtualization, I had to buy like 10 hardwares. And if you multiply, for example, $3,000 by 10, it's gonna be $30,000. So if you spend like $10,000 on one piece of hardware, where you will get more RAM, processor and other things, you are just saving like $20,000 in here. So you're saving money in here, and then you're virtualizing your operating system on one piece of hardware actually. And be careful when virtualizing. So be careful when virtualizing means that whenever you plan to do virtualization for your organization, always make sure that you choose a server, you choose a hardware that's gonna meet your requirements. For example, I need a server. So if my boss is asking me to buy a server that is going to support uh, Active Directory, that is going to support Exchange, that is going to support Skype for Business, and that is going to support SharePoint Server 2016. So what I'm doing in here is I need to make sure that I know the hardware requirement for Active Directory, for Exchange, for Skype for Business, for SharePoint. If I just go and buy a server with 20 GB of RAM and later on I just found out that this is not enough for me, or the processor that I have is like it's AMD, and it's like Core i3 or Core i anything that is less, and it's not gonna meet the requirements to run all these applications, because Exchange is something heavy. It's a heavy application, requires more hardware to run properly and to perform in a proper way. Same thing with Active Directory. If you're using like 500 MB of RAM for Active Directory, you should not be expecting better performance when users are trying to log in. And same thing with Skype for Business and SharePoint. So whenever you're trying to buy hardware, make sure that you gather the requirements. You already know that what applications you're going to install and what are their requirements, and then you can go ahead and buy the hardware. Storage is also important, like how much hard drive size you should be using. So gather the information, gather the requirements, and then go ahead and buy a server. That's why be careful again. So networking devices can also be virtualized. It's not for only servers. So these days virtualization is really getting better and better. So I just want to tell you is that virtualization is not for servers actually. Virtualization means that you can virtualize anything in these days. For example, if you are using a switch like a Cisco, a Juniper switch, a HP switch, you can virtualize it. Like these days, like a router, you can virtualize a router, you can virtualize a firewall. So all of these are networking devices which allows you to have connectivity between multiple sites, between your computers to computers. So you can virtualize networking devices too. So these days, you can virtualize all of them. So virtualization is not for servers only, it's for network devices and systems and anything that you want. So virtualization can also do failover. What does it mean in here is, for example, if I am configuring virtualization, one thing to mention in here is that virtualization is something that these days all organizations are using to save money. So what they're doing is like they are using two servers or more than two, like 4, 5, 6, 7, based on their policies, procedures, and requirements. So what you can do is you can configure clustering between them and or failover between them. So just add operating systems here. It's gonna copy all of them in here, and then for example it's gonna be active to standby. If this virtualization or virtualized hardware just goes down, this is going to become active. So that's the concept of virtualization when using a failover. So it can give you like failover. It is really good when you're doing load balancing. It can do active to active. So virtualization can also support failover, load balancing for disaster recovery purposes. So best free virtualization softwares that we have these days out in the market, so that you can use to do your practice for this video training is Oracle VirtualBox and then VMware Player. So these are two free softwares that you can use. They are free and they can help you to install operating systems and Exchange, and make sure that you just go through all labs and completely learn the training session that we are going to have. And then the best paid virtualization softwares that we have these days is virtual VMware Workstation that I'm going to use for our labs, and this is something that you have to buy, and then you have to use proper license and do the installation, and then what you can do is you can just go ahead and install operating systems and all other things. And then VMware for businesses, if you have heard the name of VMware, vSphere, so these days large organizations, enterprise organizations, banks, credit unions, small companies, medium-sized companies, all of them uses VMware. And this is one of the famous virtualization softwares where they just buy hardware, and then they do the virtualization through this, because this has more options. Like you can configure clustering, you can configure failover, you can do virtualization like connected to the storage area network, and you can do a lot of things. So there is a separate certification for VMware if you just want to have a look. And then the other thing is Citrix. Citrix is also virtualizing your desktops, where if you are like in Toronto and your main office is like in Arizona, what you can do is you can access your physical machine that is at Arizona through Citrix as a physical machine, or you can just use one of the virtualized desktops that is assigned to you, and just access it, and then use it for your like day-to-day work that you do on your businesses. So it's like desktop virtualization application that is really in use these days by many companies. So this was the concept of virtualization, and I hope you have learned something. And the other thing that we are going to do now is the lab. So we will configure our lab in our next video, where we will be installing virtualization software. So I hope you have learned something, and I'll see you on the next video.